Imagine you're walking through the narrow streets of an old town. In Europe, you look around and see houses that seem to have stepped right out of a fairy tale. But the truth is, many of them have stood there since the Middle Ages. Hundreds of years have passed, through wars, fires, and storms, and they still stand strong. How could these ancient structures have lasted so long? When there was no reinforced concrete, modern machinery, or precise measuring technology. To understand that, we have to go back in time. Starting with medieval society, where the social class you were born into would determine the type of house you lived in. Medieval society was a living pyramid. Imagine medieval society, like a giant pyramid. At the top was the royalty, the king and queen, those born into power, making big decisions like declaring war, setting laws, and collecting taxes. You could say they won the birth lottery. Born as the bosses. Right below them was the nobility. Those who owned vast lands, hosted lavish parties, and occasionally had to go to war with the king, though not exactly what they liked. But if you play big, you have to pay the price. Next was the middle class, which is where things get interesting. These were the merchants, artisans, and small workshop owners. They weren't as rich as the nobility, but they lived comfortably. Ko the unung, agg vanio, may md and khan, ss. A second pair of shoes. It sounds funny, but it was a fortune back then. The rest were commoners, making up 90% of the population. They were hard-working farmers, working from dawn till dusk to feed the entire society. Some were free peasants, others were serfs. Like employees with a permanent contract with their lord, but with no salary, no days off, and covered in mud. What was the role of each class? The royalty and nobility were tasked with protecting the other classes, at least in theory. In reality, they sometimes cared more about their wine cellars than the lives of peasants. Additionally, they also arbitrated lawsuits, like an ancient version of Judge Judy, but more powerful and easily angered. The middle class kept the economy running. They produced goods, sold wholesale, ran workshops, and provided vocational training through guilds. Guilds were professional organizations, like guilds mixed with quality control systems. Want to become a blacksmith? You had to apprentice for several years. Practice not burning your eyebrows before you could open your own workshop. Farmers were the true backbone. They farmed and raised livestock, paying taxes with their produce and labor. Compared to them, modern tax season might even be easier to breathe through. The church also played a huge role. Monks and priests were often somewhere in between the social classes. They preached, taught mainly for the wealthy, and helped the poor when they weren't busy building grand churches. And if you wanted to escape poverty, one of the few paths was to join a monastery. Feudalism, you work, I protect, but you're still hungry. The entire social system was held tight by a principle called feudalism. Basically, I protect you, and you farm the land and pay me taxes. Unfair, but it worked well enough to last for centuries. And of course, the peasants had no right to complain. Complain too much and you might end up in jail. Society influenced how people built houses. And this is the important point. This social structure didn't just affect lifestyles. It directly affected how people built cities and houses. Medieval cities often developed in a concentric, circular pattern, with the main cathedral or castle right at the center. You'll see it's like a birthday cake. Many layers, but instead of delicious frosting, you'll find winding, trash-filled streets. The wealthy would live closer to the center, where it was safer, more convenient, near the church. Near the market, and the city walls would be the first line of defense. Further out, houses became more crowded, cramped, and dirtier. The lower the class, the further out the location. Giant walls were like the gated communities. Of old, city walls were what protected the entire city from enemies. It was like today's gated communities. Except instead of keeping out multi-level marketers, they kept out entire armed armies. City walls could be up to 10 meters high, 3 to 4 meters thick, making modern security cameras look like toys. Cities usually had 2 to 8 gates that closed at dusk. If you stayed out late, you might have to explain yourself to some guards, who weren't very friendly. Houses. You could tell what social class you belonged to just by looking at them. Middle-class houses were often located in a dense network of specialized streets. Blacksmith's Street, Baker's Street, Tanner's Street, where the stench could kill flies. It was like an ancient shopping mall. But instead of fancy cafes, you had the sound of hammers and the risk of plague outbreaks. As for the poor's houses, they were right next to the city walls. Wooden shacks crammed together. You could reach out your hand through the window and touch your neighbors. Unless it was plague season, of course. Continuing our journey of discovery, we leave the winding streets and step into medieval homes. These medieval houses were not the magnificent castles of the nobility, but the actual dwellings of the middle class, where artisans lived and conducted business, merchants, and working families. The surprising thing is, many of them still exist today. Some people even live in them. So how were these houses built? The answer lies in a combination of creativity, experience, and a bit of dung. The timber framing technique, assembling wood like giant Lego. Most middle-class homes were built using the technique of timber framing. This means using large wooden beams, usually oak, to erect the frame. Then joining the pieces together with wooden pegs, no nails needed, like a giant ancient Lego set. The gaps between the wooden frames would be filled with something called wattle and daub. This was a mixture of woven branches, mud, straw, organic waste, and animal dung. It might sound crude, but in reality, this structure was incredibly durable and flexible. It allowed the house to expand and contract with the weather, and was especially easy to repair. A house was not cheap, but it was a generational asset. Cost: building a middle-class house of this type at that time was equivalent to 2 to 3 years of a skilled worker's income. If converted, it would be equivalent to about 500 days' worth of bread. Not cheap at all. Therefore, a house was not just a dwelling but also an investment asset that could be passed down to descendants, or rented out like a mini apartment building. Back then, the ground floor was a shop and a workshop. The first floor was often a place for trading or for trades like blacksmithing, shoemakers, or carpenters, who opened their doors right onto the street, working and selling simultaneously. You can imagine it like a tube house, used for both living and business nowadays. The only difference is that instead of the sound of sewing machines, you would hear the sound of hammers, the smell of coal, and the smell of soup simmering in the corner. The back part was usually the kitchen with a hearth, used for cooking and heating. Smoke would rise through the upper floors and escape through the roof. Yes, this was the ancient central heating system, also serving as a free smokehouse for the whole family. The upper floor was where people lived, and they lived very close together. The second floor was the living space, often just one large room divided by curtains or wooden panels. The entire family, including apprentices or servants, slept together in the same space. Beds were usually wooden frames filled with straw inside, replaced annually if you were wealthy. Otherwise, it was left as is. People often slept sitting up, believing that lying flat made it easier to die. But in reality, sleeping, sitting up, helped avoid smoke inhalation, because the upper floor was often full of fumes. From the hearth rising up, windows were not for light. Glass was extremely expensive, worth a fortune. Instead, they used oiled parchment, or thin-pressed animal horn as window material. LSPCXS, just enough light entered, while blocking wind and rainwater. Of course, it didn't keep much warmth. Medieval winters were not for the faint of heart. Smart spaces, every centimeter useful. Medieval people were extremely good at optimizing space, while niches became storage chests that also served as seats, and tables folded up against the wall. And because they lived in small spaces, all their items were you could call them the ancestors of modern minimalist design. Jetty floor, an architectural facade that protrudes. Have you ever seen old houses where the upper floor protrudes beyond the lower floor? That's called a jetty. Not for aesthetics, but to increase living space, without incurring extra taxes. As house taxes were only calculated based on ground area, it also helped shelter pedestrians from rain below, and blocked some cold wind for the ground floor. However, if you walk between 2 rows of jetty houses, it feels a bit like being swallowed by a giant mouth. But there were still luxury items. Regarding interiors, there wasn't much, but the most expensive item in the house wasn't a bed or a table, but a cooking pot. A good copper pot could be worth as much as a cow, and was often mentioned in wills. People back then valued pots like we value iPhones. Houses were not just for living in, but also for rent. Many middle-class families would rent out the upper floor, or the back room, creating supplementary income, a kind of medieval Airbnb. This shows that houses were not just shelters, but also an important part of their living and wealth-building strategy. So the question is, who actually built these houses that could last for hundreds of years? Was it a group of wizards with magic hammers? Not at all. The answer lies with the skilled craftsmen of the Middle Ages. People who, if they were alive today, would surely earn the nodding respect of modern engineers. Medieval carpenters didn't just know how to saw wood. First, we must mention the master carpenter, or the CMC. Don't think of them as just a guy carrying a hammer and saw. In fact, they were a triple-threat architect, structural engineer, and project manager of the Middle Ages. To reach this level, they had to undergo at least 7 years of apprenticeship, then a few more years as a journeyman, before being called a master. They didn't just know how to cut wood to fit, but also how to calculate its load-bearing capacity and shrinkage, how to join timbers with mortise and tenon joints, how to choose the sun's orientation, and even how to prevent the house from collapsing in strong winds. Every piece of wood was a strategic decision. The first step in construction was selecting materials, and this was a very crucial part. The craftsmen chose oak wood, but not just any wood could be used. The tree had to be at least 60 years old, felled in winter when the sap was low, which made the wood strong, durable, and less prone to warping later. After felling the trees, they air-dried the wood for another year to let it dry slowly. During that time, the team of craftsmen began digging the foundations and preparing other materials: stone, mortar, cow dung, and an indescribable smell. The foundation of the house was built with large stones to prevent the wood from direct contact with the ground. Otherwise, termites and dampness would attack within a few years. The material used to fill the timber frame wattle and daub was made from woven branches, mud, straw, cow dung, and even animal hair. Yes, if you lived back then, your neighbor's goat hair might appear in your house wall. Everyone had a task. Building a house was like a group project. The construction process was a collective effort of a team of specialized craftsmen with key roles. Sawyers cut large logs into planks. One person stood above, one in the pit, taking the full brunt of the sawdust rain. Carpenters cut, marked, and joined the timber frames according to the design. Masons prepared the stone foundation, mortared and built the base. Plasterers applied the daub mixture to the house frame. Each piece of wood was marked like assembly instructions. Medieval IKEA. Except there were no Allen wrenches, and quite a lot of swearing when a joint was wrong. Assembling the timber frame was like erecting a giant skeleton. The timber frame was first assembled on the ground, like a giant house skeleton. Then, sections were lifted using ropes, pulleys, and manpower. This spectacle often attracted the entire neighborhood to watch. Like an ancient house-raising ceremony, there was certainly beer, wine, and cheering, and no hard hats. Where did the raw materials come from? All materials had to be sourced locally, or manually transported from elsewhere. Stone, if near a quarry, was good. Otherwise, it had to be hauled for miles by ox cart. Clay for mixing the daub was dug from nearby pits. Lime was burnt from limestone in kilns outside the city walls. The smell was so foul that there was a law requiring building kilns downwind from residential areas. Straw and animal hairs sourced from local farmers. Nothing was wasted. Even hair cut from sheep was utilized to make binding mortar. This is perhaps the first example of sustainable construction. No machinery, yet precise to the millimeter. Even without laser measuring devices or tape measures, the craftsmen still ensured astonishing accuracy. They used measuring ropes with knots at fixed intervals, plumb bobs to determine verticality, and wooden templates to create perfectly fitted joints. Their tools included axes, saws, and chisels. All were hand-forged and often family heirlooms, passed down from father to son like treasures. A unique secret was using fresh wood to self-tighten the frame. A very clever trick. Some parts of the frame were made from fresh wood, or greenwood. As the wood gradually dried, it would shrink, tightening the joints, and making the house frame more solid. A form of self-tightening bolt. Except this process lasted several years. In the initial phase, the new house would creak every night, leading many to believe the house was haunted. But in reality, it was just physics working as it should. INBNT HIIUKNG CDTNTLOHND TRNKN IUKHN. While the carpenters and masons were sweating, building timber-framed houses for the middle class, in another world, still within the same city, the nobility and royalty lived in great structures that made all ordinary people for the first time admire and sigh. If middle-class houses were like good bicycles, then noble houses were stone Rolls-Royces. Massive, splendid, and super durable. The elegant houses of the nobility? A symbol and bankrupting the houses of medieval nobility. They were not merely dwellings but symbols of power. Many places called them manor houses, while others were literally castles. And if you think they were expensive, then imagine this. A large-scale noble's house could cost an amount of money equivalent to 855 wages of a skilled craftsman. And that was just the construction cost. The interior, stained glass, embroidered carpets, silver and gold goblets were a whole different world. Just one glass window pane could cost as much as a small farm. So, if you see 3-meter thick stone walls but tiny windows, you understand why. Built with rubble, field masonry, stone sandwiching, stone. These stone houses were built using a technique called rubble, field masonry, meaning 2 layers of neatly cut stone, sandwiching a core layer of rubble. In the middle, imagine a giant sandwich. They could block arrows, sledgehammers, and even trebuchets. Thanks to their extremely sturdy structure, these structures not only withstood enemies, but also survived fires, floods, storms, and time. Many castles still stand strong today. Hundreds of years after their first owners have rested in peace. Long ago, interior, from the Great Hall to high-end toilets. In contrast to simple timber-framed houses, castles could have dozens of rooms, clearly divided into areas for living, working, resting, and dining. The heart of each residence was the Great Hall. Niti Chaktiak, High HFVA. The heating system was also sophisticated, with fireplaces that had chimneys, a groundbreaking technology at the time, that allowed smoke to escape directly upwards, instead of filling the room like in common houses. The workforce operating was like an ancient enterprise. A noble house could not operate with just the owner's family. Typically, there were 30 to 50 servants, divided by rank and duty, from the steward, cooks to the keeper of the wardrobe. There was also the master of the horse, who managed transportation, and the food taster, the most dangerous profession at the time, because if any dish was poisoned, they were done for. This whole system operated like a corporation, with the lord as CEO. The only difference was no Zoom meetings. Windows were for both viewing and defense. Castle windows were intricately designed, set deep within thick walls, creating window seats for embroidery, reading, or watching for enemies. Young noblewomen could look out at the fields, while composing a few verses, or keeping an eye out for suspicious individuals emerging from the forest. Some castles even had rainwater pipes, collecting water from the roof and distributing it throughout the house via lead pipes. Yes, back then, no one knew lead was toxic. So, in some cases, the poor who used wells might have lived healthier lives, built to last for centuries. They indeed have lasted. Stones were carefully selected. Foundations were dug deep into the bedrock. Large stones had molten lead poured into their joints to prevent vibration and moisture. The roof used giant oak beams, many of which dated back to the Roman era, meaning the trees had grown for hundreds of years before the house was built. It's no surprise that many noble buildings still exist to this day, becoming museums, hotels, or Netflix filming locations. Meanwhile, how did commoners live? In complete contrast to the sturdy castles, were the thatched huts of the peasants. If a noble house was a Rolls-Royce, a peasant's house was a bicycle sheltering 5 people and 2 chickens. The area of a typical house was only about 12 to 20 square meters, smaller than a modern living room, and in that space lived the entire family, plus livestock, cows, goats, chickens, all living together under one roof. Built with whatever they could find. Peasants didn't have oak wood or building stone. They used wild plants, mud, straw, dung, sometimes even mixed with bones or broken pottery shards. The method was called cruck construction, 2 larger-shaped frames leaning against each other, then roofed and plastered with anything sticky and cheap. The roofs were thatched if well made. They lasted a few years. If poor, they had to be temporarily replaced every year. Sometimes they had to be thatched with wild leaves, grass, or even earth with growing grass, accidentally creating the first eco-homes in history. Earthen floors and ancient toilets. The floors were usually packed earth, covered with straw or dry leaves to retain heat. Over many years of walking, the floors would sink, which archaeologists later excitedly called sunken features. In reality, they were just holes that collected water whenever it rained. Sanitation was non-existent. Toilets were just pits dug behind the house, or temporary drainage ditches, often becoming streams of waste flowing through the village. If you lived in the hot season, you'd understand. After a long journey, from the magnificent castles of the nobility, to the cozy, timber-framed houses of the middle class, and then to the rustic thatched huts of the peasants, you might wonder, what made these medieval houses last so long? While many modern structures only last a few decades before deteriorating, the answer lies not in technology, but in wisdom, meticulousness, and a timeless approach to construction. Each social class had its own building style and way of life. First, it's important to recognize that medieval homes clearly reflected social class. The homes of the nobility were true fortresses, both symbols of power and shields against war. Thick walls, large stones, multiple layers, complete with sewage systems and sometimes even lead plumbing systems. The houses of the middle class were a combination of living space and workplace, compact, space-saving, yet intelligent and practical. Sturdy timber frames, thick earthen walls, overhanging roofs, and every inch of space utilized. The homes of commoners were the result of a spirit of using whatever was available and building as quickly as possible. With continuous repairs, they were more fragile, but also an important part of the medieval urban ecosystem. Whether simple or complex, each type of house accurately reflected the needs, capabilities, and social role of its inhabitants. What made them sustainable was not technology, but a mindset. There's an interesting truth. Medieval houses had no iron, steel, or cement, no laser measurement systems. Yet they could last 350 to 500 years, or even longer. Reason 1. Smart material selection. Wood was chosen seasonally and dried long enough for natural shrinkage. Stone was sourced locally and not mixed. Walls were breathable, not completely sealed, but maintained stable temperature and humidity. 2. Flexible structure. Timber frames used mortise and tenon joints instead of nails, allowing them to expand and contract with the weather without cracking. Materials like adobe, mud, mixed with straw and dung, could be repaired in small sections, making them easy to maintain. 3. Generational experience. Skills were not written down, but passed down from one generation to the next. Like a family legacy, apprentices learned from a young age, undergoing many years of practical training. 4. The mindset of building to live with. They didn't build to sell, they built to live, to pass down, and to work in. Each house was a part of life, not just real estate. When a house is a living entity, for medieval people, the house was not separate from nature, but a part of it. Wood dried and tightened the frame, making the house stronger over time. Damage could be patched with materials from the field itself, without needing imported supplies. Thatch roofs needed regular replacement, which connected homeowners more deeply with their homes. You could consider it a form of living architecture. Houses changed with the weather, growing and aging with the people living in them. Whether small or large, each dwelling carried a story. A decaying thatched peasant house. There are also stories where a family of 6 and 2 cows lived together through the winter. A timber-framed house in a bustling street is a testament to the rise of the middle class. A magnificent castle bears the marks of wars, weddings, and political intrigues. Every stone, every timber, every crack is a witness to time. And whether you stand in York, Bordeaux, or any ancient city in Europe, you can see history's story emerging through every wall. A lesson for the present: how to build to last. If there's anything the modern world can learn from medieval architecture, it is this. Don't underestimate natural materials. Earth, wood, and stone, if properly handled, can transcend time. Don't underestimate human craftsmanship. Without machines, sturdy structures can still be built. With enough skill and patience, build to use, not just to sell. The old building philosophy leaned towards long-term use, passed down through generations instead of changing hands every 15 years. Hundreds of years have passed. Wars, weather, plagues, and time have swept away many things. But medieval houses, with all their simplicity, creativity, and resilience, still stand. They are not just structures, but living milestones in humanity's evolutionary journey. And next time you walk past an old house, a timber-framed one that seems to lean as if about to collapse, remember, it has stood there longer than most of us have lived, and it will probably still be there when you return.